Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
There are football matches that are remembered because of the result. There are others remembered because of a goal, a promotion, or a great performance. And then there are matches that become part of football folklore for an entirely different reason. On the 3rd of September 1983, Chelsea travelled to Brighton for what, on paper, was simply a second division fixture. But by the time the weekend was over, Brighton had witnessed scenes that would be remembered for decades. Chelsea supporters had travelled to the south coast in enormous numbers. Trouble had already erupted across Brighton the night before the match. The following afternoon, the Goldstone Ground was packed with supporters, many of them Chelsea fans who had managed to find their way into virtually every part of the stadium. And when the final whistle eventually came, the football seemed almost incidental. Police officers were attacked. The pitch was invaded. Part of the ground was damaged. Supporters were injured. And one Chelsea player would actually find himself arrested after allegedly telling a police officer to leave him alone. So, how did a second division football match between Brighton and Chelsea descend into one of the most notorious outbreaks of violence ever witnessed at the Goldstone Ground? And perhaps more importantly, what was it actually like to be there? Because the memories of that weekend, more than 40 years later, remain remarkably vivid. For some Chelsea supporters, it was one of the greatest away days of their lives. For some Brighton supporters, it was something altogether different. And somewhere between those two versions of events lies the story of Brighton versus Chelsea, September 1983. The summer of 1983 was an important one for Chelsea. The club had just been relegated from the first division a few years earlier and was rebuilding in the second division. There was a feeling that Chelsea were beginning to put themselves back together again. The team had started the new season brilliantly. A 5-0 victory over Derby County had been followed by an away win at Brighton. And this was not simply a case of Chelsea supporters travelling to watch their team play football. The away following was becoming a spectacle in itself. The Chelsea supporters of the period had developed a reputation that stretched far beyond Stamford Bridge. The Chelsea headhunters were becoming one of the most notorious football firms in the country, and wherever Chelsea travelled, there was always the possibility that trouble would follow. Brighton, meanwhile, was a seaside resort, and on the face of it, that might have sounded like the perfect destination for a football away day. Sunshine, the coast, pubs, an afternoon by the sea. But Brighton also had its own football following and its own reputation for violence. So when thousands of Chelsea supporters began making their way south, there was already a sense that this was not going to be an ordinary Saturday afternoon. In fact, for some people, the weekend had already begun before the football had even been played. Chelsea supporters began arriving in Brighton on the Friday night, and according to later recollections, running battles broke out across the town involving Chelsea supporters, Brighton youths, and the police. Some accounts even claimed that people were injured in the violence, while there were later stories of weapons and petrol bombs being discovered. Other supporters remembered the night rather differently, but almost everyone who has spoken about that weekend agrees on one thing. Brighton was expecting trouble. One Chelsea supporter later recalled travelling down on the Friday night and being herded into the subway by police. Another remembered sleeping in a hut on the seafront. Others have described Chelsea supporters arriving from Friday onwards and turning the town into a sea of blue. And that was before the match itself. For teenagers and young men travelling to football in 1983, getting to an away game could be an adventure in itself. There were no smartphones, no social media, no live updates telling you what was happening 5 miles away. You simply got on a train and went. One Chelsea supporter, who was 17 at the time, remembered working part-time at Waitrose, saving whatever money he could, while spending much of his wages on clothes associated with the emerging casual culture. He and a friend were determined to make the journey to Brighton, despite being short of money. And they found an ingenious solution. A promotion involving packets of automatic washing powder offered free British rail tickets. So they collected the tokens. Enough for a journey to Brighton. And early on the Saturday morning, they got on the train. What they found was extraordinary. The train was packed with Chelsea supporters, standing room only. As it approached Brighton, the atmosphere inside the carriage intensified, and when the train finally arrived, the noise apparently erupted. Chelsea! 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 Thousands of supporters poured out of Brighton station. Imagine walking out of a railway station in a seaside town and suddenly finding yourself surrounded by football supporters travelling for the same match. But this was not a few hundred away fans. Chelsea supporters were everywhere. One supporter later remembered walking from the station towards the Goldstone Ground and seeing what appeared to be a sea of Chelsea shirts and colours. Another claimed that he barely saw a Brighton supporter. Of course, that recollection needs to be treated carefully. There were certainly Brighton supporters at the match, and later memories from Albion fans make that very clear. But what is undeniable is that Chelsea had travelled in huge numbers. The official attendance is often given as just over 20,000. Yet some supporters who were there believed the actual number inside the ground was considerably higher. Estimates of the Chelsea following vary enormously. Some accounts put it at around 8,000. Others claimed 10,000 or more. And some Chelsea supporters who were actually there believed the figure could have been substantially higher still. Whatever the true number was, there is plenty of agreement that Chelsea had supporters scattered throughout the Goldstone. The away section became so crowded that some supporters could barely move. Others found themselves in parts of the ground where they weren't supposed to be. And this is where the atmosphere becomes particularly difficult to imagine today. There were no modern turnstile systems, no smartphones displaying digital tickets, no heavily segregated stadiums in the way we know them now. Supporters could find their way into different parts of the ground, and on this particular afternoon, Chelsea supporters had managed to infiltrate virtually every area. One Chelsea supporter remembered getting into the ground early because he feared the away end would become impossible to enter later. But even that wasn't enough. The Chelsea support continued to swell, and suddenly Brighton's home ground felt very different. There was a strange atmosphere developing, a Brighton home game that didn't necessarily feel like a normal Brighton home game. Then the football began. Chelsea started brightly, and in the first half, Kerry Dixon stepped up to take a penalty. He scored. Chelsea were ahead. The reaction was enormous. One supporter later described what he called the biggest bounce he had ever experienced. He remembered his feet barely touching the ground as the Chelsea end erupted. For the supporters packed into the Goldstone, this was everything they had travelled for. Chelsea were winning, the atmosphere was electric, and there was still plenty of football to play. Brighton eventually responded. Alan Young scored in the second half, reducing the deficit. But, according to some Chelsea recollections, the reaction around the ground was noticeably subdued. And perhaps that shouldn't be surprising. If thousands of Chelsea supporters had genuinely found their way into different sections of the Goldstone, how many Brighton supporters were actually going to celebrate openly? Then, With the game approaching its conclusion, Chelsea struck again. Kerry Dixon scored his second. Chelsea were 2-1 up. The travelling support erupted once more, and this time the celebration continued all the way towards the final whistle. For Chelsea, it was a huge away victory. For Brighton, it was a painful defeat, but nobody inside the Goldstone could have known what was about to happen when the referee finally brought the game to an end, because the final whistle didn't end the drama. It started it. Chelsea supporters began pouring onto the pitch from different parts of the ground. Some wanted to celebrate. Others had something altogether more confrontational in mind. And suddenly, the police found themselves standing between a huge crowd of Chelsea supporters and the pitch. The numbers were heavily against them. One account described an officer becoming engulfed by the crowd. Other reports said several police officers were attacked and injured. And according to contemporary recollections, 7 constables were injured during the disorder. The north goal was also damaged. The scene rapidly became chaotic. Supporters were on the pitch. Police were attempting to regain control. And what might initially have been a pitch invasion following an important away victory had turned into something much more serious. One Chelsea supporter later recalled watching a police officer being swallowed up by the crowd. Interestingly, he didn't remember the moment with pride. He remembered feeling sorry for the officer. That is one of the things that makes these old stories so fascinating. But those same memories can contain moments that, viewed from the present day, are genuinely difficult to comprehend. And there is perhaps no better example than what happened at the Goldstone that afternoon. The police were eventually able to regain some control. But the damage had already been done. And remarkably, the story didn't end there. Because standing on the pitch was one of the Chelsea players himself, Chris Hutchings. Hutchings had applauded the travelling Chelsea supporters. To him, perhaps, it was simply acknowledging the fans. But a police officer apparently interpreted his actions as encouragement for the crowd. Hutchings was ordered to leave the pitch. He refused. The officer apparently told him again. Hutchings still refused. And eventually, according to Hutchings' own later account, the exchange ended with him telling the officer to fuck off before running towards a tunnel. He didn't get away with it. Hutchings was arrested. A Chelsea footballer had been caught up in the disorder and was now facing court proceedings. And the story becomes even stranger from there. Because only a few weeks later, Chris Hutchings would become a Brighton player. Yes, the same player who had been arrested on the pitch during one of the most notorious incidents in the Goldstone's history would soon be playing for Brighton. He was eventually fined £250 for threatening and abusive behaviour, and that might have been the end of the story, except it wasn't, because Brighton supporters would eventually come to regard Hutchings as one of their own. The player, who had once been arrested while playing against Brighton, would go on to pull on the Albion shirt. Football really could produce some extraordinary stories. But while Hutchings was dealing with the consequences of his actions, the violence wasn't necessarily confined to the pitch. According to later recollections, Chelsea supporters made their way back into Brighton, and for some local people, this was where the weekend became truly frightening. One Brighton supporter remembered being confronted after failing to name the Chelsea team when challenged by a group of Chelsea supporters. He and his friends were attacked and eventually ended up in Brighton General Hospital. He later recalled hearing the commotion continuing while he was being treated. Other injured people were arriving. Ambulances were bringing in casualties. Even some police officers appeared to be badly hurt. And that recollection gives us an idea of just how far removed this was from a normal football Saturday. The violence had become something bigger than what was happening inside the Goldstone. It had spread into the surrounding area. Cars were reportedly overturned, police were attacked, and supporters from both sides had their own memories of the disorder. But there is an important distinction to make here, because some later Chelsea recollections claimed that Brighton supporters were virtually absent from the ground and that Chelsea simply took over the entire town. Brighton supporters strongly dispute that version. They remember their own supporters being involved in confrontations throughout the weekend. They remember violence before the match. They remember violence afterwards. And they reject the idea that there were simply thousands of Chelsea supporters wandering around a town with nobody prepared to oppose them. The reality was almost certainly more complicated. Brighton had its own hooligan element. Chelsea had travelled in huge numbers. Police were dealing with an enormous crowd, and the atmosphere had already been poisoned by the previous night's disorder. So, when the final whistle came, the ingredients for a serious confrontation were already there. And perhaps this is why the Brighton-Chelsea match has survived in football folklore for so long. It wasn't simply 90 minutes of football, it was an entire weekend. Friday night, Saturday morning, the train journey, the pubs, the streets, the Goldstone, the goals, the pitch invasion, the police, the arrests, the hospital, and the stories that continued long after the supporters had gone home. For Chelsea supporters, the memories are understandably very different. Some describe it as one of the greatest away days they ever experienced. They remember Chelsea supporters everywhere. They remember the atmosphere. They remember the feeling of being part of an enormous travelling support. One supporter simply described it as the day Chelsea took over Brighton. Another remembered sleeping in his friend's Triumph Spitfire after travelling down the night before. Another somehow found his way into the Brighton end before eventually getting onto the pitch and opening a gate for other Chelsea supporters. And another supporter recalled arriving with a broken arm, surrounded by Chelsea fans, while knowing that some of his own friends were Brighton supporters. These are the memories that help explain why football supporters from that generation still talk about these matches decades later. But there is another side to nostalgia. The same weekend that one supporter remembers as one of the best days of my life was remembered by another as a terrifying experience that ended with people in hospital. And both memories can exist at the same time. That is what makes documenting football history so important. We don't have to celebrate what happened. We don't have to pretend it was harmless. And we don't have to erase it from history either. We can simply ask what football was like in Britain at a time when the relationship between supporters, police, and football grounds was dramatically different from what we know today. Because the Goldstone incident also raises a fascinating question: could it have been prevented? There are those who believe the police response actually escalated the situation once supporters entered the pitch. Others believe the police had little choice but to intervene after the crowd invaded the playing area and officers were attacked. And then there was the question of policing beforehand. If thousands of Chelsea supporters were expected to travel to Brighton, should the authorities have been better prepared? Should the match have been all ticket? Should segregation have been stricter? Could more effective policing have prevented the pitch invasion? Or was the scale of the travelling support simply too great for the authorities to control using the methods available to them in 1983? These are questions worth debating, and I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Because when you look back at incidents like Brighton versus Chelsea today, it's easy to judge them purely through a modern lens. But the people who lived through football in the early 1980s experienced an entirely different football culture. There were fewer restrictions. There were fewer cameras. There was far less technology. And supporters had a freedom around football grounds that is almost impossible to imagine today. But with that freedom came consequences. And the Goldstone Ground on the 3rd of September 1983 provided one of the clearest examples. Chelsea won the match 2-1. Kerry Dixon scored twice. Alan Young scored Brighton's goal. Chelsea continued their impressive season and would eventually win the second division title. But that result is almost a footnote now. What people remember is everything that happened around it. The enormous Chelsea following, the stories of trouble across Brighton, the packed Goldstone, the pitch invasion, the injured police officers, the damage to goal, the supporters taken to hospital, and a Chelsea player being arrested before, only weeks later, becoming a Brighton player himself. More than 40 years have passed since that afternoon. The Goldstone Ground is gone. The football culture that existed around it has changed beyond recognition. The trains are different. The grounds are different. The policing is different. And the relationship between football supporters and the game itself has changed enormously. Thankfully, scenes like those witnessed at the Goldstone are not accepted as simply another part of the football experience today. But for the people who were there, the memories remain. Some remember the excitement. Some remember the fear. Some remember the singing. Some remember the violence. And some probably remember all of it. So when people say that football in the 1980s was better, perhaps the more honest question is this. Which part of it do you actually miss? The terraces, the atmosphere, the freedom, the friendships, the clothes, the away days, or simply being young enough to believe that every Saturday could become an adventure? Because Brighton versus Chelsea in 1983 was certainly an adventure, just not necessarily the kind that everybody wanted. And that is the story of the day Chelsea came to Brighton, a match that finished 2-1, but a weekend that would be remembered for far more than football. You can now find us on Facebook, where we are building up a nice, like-minded community. Just type in Everything Casual on Facebook, and our page will pop up. Feel free to message me on there if you have any good stories or suggestions for a future video. Thank you to everyone that has sent me stories, videos, and pictures. I will be using them soon. And thank you to everyone that has taken the time to watch this video. Give us a like and subscribe if you are a fan of the football casual culture. See you next time.